Today we're going to be covering a very controversial topic during the Cold War, the Bay of Pigs invasion. In the eyes of many, the 1960s are regarded as one of the most chaotic decades in the past century. The Cold War was at its peak, and tensions between communist and anti-communist ideologies were high. Two powerful countries, the United States and the Soviet Union, had governments which lined up with both sides of the coin, the former for anti-communism and the latter for a communist take on government. Because of this fissure in belief systems, the tensions which radiated from these two countries also trickled down to their satellite states and influenced countries. One main example of this was Cuba. On New Year's Day, 1959, a Cuban nationalist staged a coup and overthrew the government of Cuba. That certain nationalist was named Fidel Castro, and the government he overthrew just so happened to be backed by the United States. This didn't go over too well with the U.S. government, mainly because even though that the former leader, named Fulgencio Batista, was seen as a repressive dictator, he was an ally to American corporations. This proved to be very beneficial to the U.S., as over half of all sugar plantations in Cuba at the time were owned by American companies, and many of Cuba's other industries, such as cattle ranches and mines, were also owned by American companies. When Castro seized power, he almost immediately began to remove American influences from Cuba, like nationalizing the American industries of sugar and mining. These actions were deemed a giant threat to the U.S., so in 1960, the President of the United States, Dwight Eisenhower, authorized the recruitment of over 1,400 Cuban exiles who fled following Castro's coup d'etat. Also in 1960, Castro began establishing diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union, which further enraged the U.S. and caused the American government to prohibit the import of Cuban sugar. The Soviets in turn began to buy the Cuban sugar in order to keep the Cuban economy from crashing, as sugar exports to the U.S. were 80% of all sugar exports from the country. Finally, in 1961, the U.S. government discontinued diplomacy with Cuba and furthered the preparations for their invasion of the island. The newly elected president, John F. Kennedy, wished to prove to the world, mainly the USSR, China, and even American citizens, that he was adamant about coming out on top of the Cold War. The entire purpose of the plan to use Cubans for the invasion was to keep U.S. involvement a secret in the global view, as the invasion may have been seen as an act of war by the Soviets, and even sparked retaliation. Kennedy was very skeptical of this, but was assured by the CIA that all American involvement would be kept a secret, and that the invasion could potentially spark an anti-communist uprising in Cuba. The actual plan was executed as follows. On April 15, 1961, a small group of Cubans left Nicaragua in a squadron of American B-26 bombers, which were painted to resemble stolen Cuban planes. They were tasked with destroying Castro's air force to prevent the military from retaliating against the invading land forces. The plan went to hell, and because Castro found out about the air raid, he had the planes moved away from any danger. Kennedy began to become weary, but the plan was already past the point of no return, and the exiled land forces landed on a beach at Cuba's southern shore. This particular spot was known as the Bay of Pigs. The sacred secrecy of the mission was broken when a radio station positioned on the beach broadcasted every detail of the invasion all across Cuba. Furthermore, a patch of coral reefs along the shore sank a few of the invading forces' ships, and many of the backup paratroopers landed at the wrong place on the island. Eventually, the exiled Cubans were surrounded by Castro's forces and were forced to surrender. Around 114 of the invading forces were killed, and over 1,100 were taken prisoner. The invasion was a complete disaster. After the failed invasion, the hopeful CIA and the rest of the exiled Cubans hoped Kennedy would allow the U.S. military to intervene in Cuba. But as much as Kennedy wanted to keep Cuba from the Soviets, he didn't want to risk starting World War III. The heightened tensions following the Bay of Pigs invasion eventually manifested into the Cuban Missile Crisis, which we'll cover here soon. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time on Horribly Drawn History.